It was dark. He stood up, his limbs feeling unusually stiff. It wasn't unusual in the way that his joints were ordinarily very well sprung and almost never stiff. More of the unusual in the way that he normally couldn't feel his limbs, let alone be able to move them around. He lifted one of the limbs that was connected to his upper half and studied it. It was a long, straight thing that could bend in the middle. However, the most curious thing was that it could only bend inwards. How fascinating. He watched it fold and unfold multiple times, like a word popped into his head just as he needed it. A hinge. Yes, just like a hinge. His gaze traveled down the hinge-like structure, up to where it ended in a roundish, squishy lump, which had more long, stumpy lumps sprouting out of it. Fingers. He looked at them carefully, then, with the fingers connected to his other upper limb, waggled one of them. It made a delightful cracking noise, loud and obnoxious in the dark space that he was in. He wriggled them a bit more, and listened to the musical cracking of the joints inside of them. It was interesting to think about, how he had just gained sentience a few moments ago, and the first thing he did was play with his fingers. However, enough dilly-dallying, he told himself firmly. He had a job to do. What that job was, he had no idea, but once he saw it, he was confident that he would know what to do. Putting one of his bottom limbs in front of the other, he awkwardly hobbled over to the other end of the space. In front of him appeared a large rectangular object, which was called a door. He had to go through this door to get to his job. Before he knew what was happening, he put his hand on an oblong-shaped metal thing jutting out of the door, and turned it to the right. As if by magic, the door swung open to reveal a much narrower, but also much longer space. A corridor. It was rather convenient that these random things just kept popping up into his head right when he needed it, he thought to himself as he walked out into the corridor. He was learning new things every step he took. He surveyed the area. Along one side of the corridor were many doors, complete with shiny white surfaces and oblong metal things, while hung on the other side were a lot of glossy-looking squares framed in pieces of wood. Taking a closer look, he let out a horrified gasp. There were little people stuck inside the squares. He pulled one off the wall and ran his finger down their tiny smiling faces, totally oblivious to the fact that they were trapped in some twisted prison. "Who are you?" A small voice rang out from behind him. He turned and saw a small person standing behind him, a child, a round brown object seemingly wedged under one upper limb. He felt a surge of warmth channel through his upper body. Yes, this was his job. He was sure of it. He stared at the child and thought about the question. "I don't know." The child stared back at him. "Why are you naked?" He looked down at himself and saw that he was, indeed, quite naked. "I don't know." The child seemed to be in a state of mental distress. At least they were, until they raised their head and giggled at him. "Are you a llama?" He thought very hard about the llama, but nothing seemed to come to mind. Perhaps his luck with the words had worn off. "My pa says that llamas are tall and have big eyes and very long necks," the child continued, seemingly not noticing his lack of response. "Maybe that's why you're naked. I don't think llamas wear clothes." He supposed that he could be a llama. "What's your name?" the child asked. A smile plastered on their chubby little face. They held out their upper limb, the one without the object wedged under it, and flexed their fingers. "My name's Casey." Carefully, he took hold of the child's fingers and shook them. It seemed to be the right thing to do. "I don't have a name." The child laughed. "What do you mean you don't have a name? Everyone has a name. Don't llamas have names too?" The child stared down at the ground for a few moments, before glancing back up at him, his eyes shining. "If you don't have a name, then can I call you Mr. Llama?" He didn't really mind what the child called him, and just looked back down at the fingers on his upper limb, which were currently curling around the edges of the tiny people's jail. Following his gaze, the child grinned and grabbed the jail, before turning it back around so that he could see it. "This is my family." They raised their upper limb, the object previously situated under it falling to the ground with a soft squeak, and pointed at the tiny pupils' faces one by one. "This is me." They pointed to the smallest figure. "This is Ma." They seemed a little sad at this point. "She's gone to a nicer place now, Pa told me, so it has to be true." They wiped their eyes and pointed to the next figure. "This is Sis. She's moved out for years now." Their eyes brightened up again as they pointed to the tallest figure. "And this is Pa." They flipped the square over and stared proudly at the tiny person. "Pa's awesome. He's a scientist, you see, and scientists are awesome. He does all sorts of cool things in his lab over there." The child pointed towards the door that he had previously walked out of. "He's smart too. He teaches me how to do my homework, but he's also doing sciencey stuff to save the world." The child's voice softened. "I want to be like Pa someday, doing cool things, fighting bad guys with the smarts." The child fell silent. He could see that their hands were shaking. Gently, he took the square back from them and put it back on the hook along the side of the corridor. "You know," he turned back from hanging up the tiny prison and saw the child staring at him again, though this time in a more friendly way. "My Pa went away for a really long time, and he hasn't come back even though he promised he would. Everyone at school says that he's not coming back, but they're lying." The child ducked their head slightly. "So I thought, Mr. Llama, since you can obviously leave whenever you want, maybe you could help me go look for my Pa. Can you do that, Mr. Llama?" He wanted to say something nice to the child, to perhaps comfort them about their predicament. There was something that he had to do hiding right at the back of his head, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't seem to grasp it, so he just nodded. "I knew I could count on you, Mr. Llama," the child beamed. And I'm going to give you a secret code, the one that my Pa and I use when we want to send secret messages to each other. It's really, really secret, so you can't tell anyone. Got that, Mr. Llama? In this way, when you find my Pa and tell him the secret code, he can know that I sent you to find him, and he'll come home. Then we can make chocolate cookies together just like he said we would. Don't worry, Mr. Llama. I'll make sure to save them for you." They shook their head. "But never mind that. What's important is the code." He knew what to do now. Folding his fingers in, he put his fist in the center of the child's forehead, cutting off their words, before raising the fist and holding it to his own. He didn't know what the gesture meant, but somehow he knew that it was a sign of reassurance. The child stared up at him, their eyes suddenly sharp and alert, their mouth gaping, looking not at all comforted. He reared back a little in surprise. Had he done something wrong? Perhaps he had misinterpreted the motion. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the child spoke before he could. "How do you know that?" they demanded, their top lip quivering slightly. "Only Pa and I are supposed to know that. It's our secret code. How do you know it?" "I don't know." His gaze slid to the floor. He was confused, terribly confused. A mess of different feelings were rising up inside of him, but he didn't know what any of them were. "I don't know."